You may be wondering what to actually do during an exposure. I get this question a lot. First, your number one job is just be willing to do the exposure. Try to not judge yourself about doing it right or wrong, or just do the exposure with an attitude of willingness to face your fear, and your brain will learn on its own without you telling yourself anything. Your brain will even learn if you panic. You just have to show up and do the exposure. But there are some helpful tips that I want to give you. The first tip is to do your best to not protect yourself from feeling anxiety and discomfort. People with agoraphobia often have a habit of treating themselves like they're very fragile, and too much of an exposure might completely wreck them. Now, this kind of thinking is because the symptoms can be a lot to tolerate at first, but your symptoms are not dangerous and they're only temporary. For most people, anxiety symptoms can linger for hours and sometimes even into the next day. But this gets better as you build up your tolerating and moving through those symptoms and becoming less and less afraid of them. Now, some people will try to distract themselves during exposures. For example, they might do an exposure of being alone or sitting in a restaurant, and they might want to distract themselves. They might use their cell phone and different devices to do that. Or if they're driving in a car, they might play music and sing. They're trying to distract themselves. So remember that distraction is an avoidance behavior. It's an attempt to escape the feeling of anxiety. Avoidance behaviors they're going to slow down your progress, if not halt it altogether. So you don't want to do anything to avoid feeling anxious. Be willing to feel the anxiety. In fact, the opposite approach to avoiding anxiety is inviting anxiety in. Welcome it to stay for as long as it wants to stay during your exposures, and any time for that matter. Now, this really helps to teach your brain to not fear anxiety symptoms. Now, I'm sure you have heard the phrase lean into it. And that means that you're willing to feel it. You're not trying to lower your anxiety or manage it or stop it or not feel it. Just acknowledge what you're feeling and allow it to be there. Now, if you would like, you can even describe what you're feeling out loud or in your head. I'm feeling dizzy. I'm feeling my hands sweat. I'm feeling tingling and numbness in my face and hands. Now, what I don't advise is saying anything that is a negative judgment. So an example of a negative judgment is, I can't do this. I can't stand it. This is horrible. Do you see the difference? Describing what you feel is just a realistic description. There's no negativity or judgment attached to it. Negative judgment statements like, I can't stand this, I wish it would stop, will only scare your brain and keep you anxious and in fight or flight longer. Now, in driving exposures, I do advise people to, release the tension in their shoulders and their arms and their hands while driving. Kind of white knuckling it through an exposure only sends a message to your brain that you're in danger. So do your best to release the tension in your hands, your arms, your shoulders. You're not doing relaxation exercises because that can be a form of experiential avoidance. You're just loosening your grip. Now, people often ask, how long should I stay in an exposure? So that's a great question. It's going to be different for every person and every exposure. So there is a certain learning that takes place in every exposure. There is a certain threshold that you pass where you thought something bad might happen, and then you pass that threshold and your brain learns something, right? Now, what you learn is the fun part. You're doing the exposures as little experiments to see what you learn. You might learn that you panicked, but you managed it. You might learn that you got dizzy, but you didn't faint. You might learn that whatever you thought was going to happen didn't happen. Or if it did happen, you're going to learn how you handled it. So you want to stay in the exposure long enough to see what happens and have that learning experience. Now, if I'm working with someone that believes that they will not be able to handle standing in line longer than 15 minutes, then it is important that they do learn what will happen after 15 minutes. Now, if they're afraid of traveling beyond their city limit, then they're going to need to see what happens when they do that. So some people might be afraid of feeling panic symptoms like DPDR, a racing heart, dizziness, etc., and their exposures will include interoceptive exposures, where they're going to continue in their exposures past the point of feeling those symptoms. So identify what your fear boundary or your threshold is and design exposures where you give yourself opportunities to learn what happens when you go beyond that threshold or boundary. So you do want to try your best to not leave an exposure situation at the very height of your anxiety or panic. Now, in that situation, the brain will learn that you're only safe because you left. And then it will be more difficult the next time. So try to stay beyond that discomfort. Now, if the discomfort does not go down at all, then you decide how long you can stay and tolerate, while you're tolerating it. But the timing of your exposures will be constantly changing. You're going to have easier days, easier exposures, more challenging days, more challenging exposures. Now, I do advise against taking days off for recovery after an exposure. Let's say you had heightened sensations and symptoms. I want you to get right back to doing an exposure the next day, and don't let your brain convince you that somehow you're too fragile or your symptoms were too severe. This is just fear of fear taking over. You have to push through that scenario and prove to yourself that you can do it. There is evidence that taking a 10-minute break after an exposure and then doing another exposure trial right away adds considerably to your overall progress. The brain is like, oh wow, they're doing that thing again. I guess it must not be that dangerous then. So take every opportunity to take a short break and repeat that difficult exposure a few minutes later. Now, another helpful hint is to do your exposures within 6 hours of sleep. It helps by consolidating your new safety learning into your long-term memory during sleep. I also want you to remind you that every exposure helps, even ones where anxiety or panic decides to show up. There's research that suggests that even when people described having a bad exposure, and by bad they mean that they felt panicked or highly anxious the whole time, the brain still learns. And the main goal is to get better and better at tolerating whatever shows up. Now, this may sound challenging, but if you begin to panic during an exposure, it's best to stay in that exposure and to let your body do whatever it's going to do without retreating or resisting or trying to calm yourself. Allowing the panic to build up and just wash over you, come down slightly, allowing it instead of trying to avoid it or resist it or calm yourself is ultimately going to help you to recover. There's nothing dangerous or harmful about having high anxiety or a panic attack. You're still in control. Now, even in exposures where you do experience panic symptoms, your brain is still learning that you're safe and that you're tolerating it. And as your brain notices that you're not retreating, when you experience those symptoms, it learns that there's no reason to trigger your fight or flight response in the first place. So I hope that these tips help you. For more help with agoraphobia or panic, go to PaigePradko.com.